4 United States Navy destroyers gone. 1,200 American sailors dead or missing. And the country that did it just went on the record and said it will do it again. I need you to understand what I am about to tell you, because I have spent 30 years watching American presidents manage military crises. I have watched carefully calibrated escalation ladders. I have watched diplomatic off-ramps constructed with precision to avoid the kind of direct confrontation that drags the entire world into the fire. I have watched administrations navigate that razor-thin line between credibility and catastrophe with varying degrees of skill. But I have never, in 30 years of doing this, seen anything like what Donald Trump woke up to this morning. 4 American destroyers sunk in a single engagement. 1,200 sailors dead or missing. And Iran has already announced publicly, officially, on the record, that it will do it again if America's response crosses a threshold that Iran itself has unilaterally defined. That is not a military crisis. That is a civilizational moment. And the full mobilization order that Trump issued within 2 hours of receiving the damage assessment has set a clock running over the Strait of Hormuz and the broader Middle East that is now measured not in days, but in hours. Here is what you need to understand before any of this makes sense. At 11:47 p.m. local time, Iranian Aerospace Force and IRGC naval units launched a coordinated strike package of 300 missiles against the American destroyer squadron operating in the waters between Jask Island and the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. 300 missiles in a single engagement against 4 of the most sophisticated warships the United States Navy has ever put to sea. The USS Gravely, the USS Nitze, the USS Mason, the USS Farragut Sherman, 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers operating in a patrol configuration that had become routine over the preceding weeks. A presence mission, designed to signal American commitment to freedom of navigation through the most strategically critical maritime choke point on the planet. That routine became a catastrophe in under 20 minutes. Stay with me, because in the next several minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly how Iran pulled this off, what Trump's full retaliation order actually means in operational terms, why the Strait of Hormuz transforms every American military option from a difficult decision into a potentially catastrophic one, and where this ends, or whether it ends at all. Because here is the thing, the question every government on Earth is urgently asking right now, whether the American response can achieve its objectives without triggering consequences that spiral beyond anyone's ability to control, has no comfortable answer. And anyone telling you otherwise is not being straight with you. Let us start at the beginning. 300 missiles, 4 destroyers, 20 minutes. The anatomy of a naval catastrophe. From a professional standpoint, the strike Iran executed against the American destroyer squadron off Jask Island is the most sophisticated anti-ship engagement in the history of modern naval warfare. I do not use that characterization lightly, and I want to be precise about why it earns that description. Because understanding how 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers were sunk in under 20 minutes requires understanding both the technical sophistication of what Iran deployed and the specific vulnerabilities in American naval air defense architecture that the engagement ruthlessly exploited. Look, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is the backbone of American naval air defense. Its Aegis combat system, the most capable shipborne air defense architecture ever deployed, integrates a Spy-1 radar, standard missile interceptors, and a combat management system that can simultaneously track and engage multiple targets across a wide range of threat categories. 4 of them, operating in a coordinated formation, with overlapping radar coverage and shared targeting data, constitute an air defense umbrella that no single category threat can reliably defeat. Iran's operational planners understood this completely, so they did not try to defeat Aegis in a fair fight. A fair fight against Aegis does not produce the outcome Iran needed. Instead, they designed a strike package engineered to defeat Aegis by simultaneously presenting threat categories across the full spectrum of engagement difficulty, in a volume and sequencing that would exhaust the interceptor capacity before the most lethal weapons ever arrived. Here is how it worked. The opening salvo: 120 Khalij-Fars anti-ship ballistic missiles. The forcing move. The Khalij-Fars is a maneuvering reentry vehicle specifically designed for anti-ship employment. It acquires and tracks surface vessels in its terminal phase, adjusting its trajectory to compensate for target movement. At hypersonic terminal velocities, it presents an interception geometry that pushes the standard missile SM-3 to the absolute edge of its performance envelope. 4 destroyers, combined SM-3 inventory of approximately 80 rounds, were presented with 120 incoming ballistic threats simultaneously. Do the math. 80 interceptors against 120 targets, with each engagement requiring radar tracking time, interceptor flight time, and kill assessment before the next engagement can even be initiated. The SM-3 inventory was exhausted before all 120 ballistic threats had been engaged. That was not an accident. That was the plan. Into the gaps created by that SM-3 exhaustion, the second wave arrived. 110 NOR anti-ship cruise missiles, flying their terminal approach at altitudes between 5 and 10 meters above sea level, using sea-skimming flight profiles to stay below the radar horizon of the defending ships until they were within a range that provided minimal time to respond. SM-2 point defense systems were expended against the NOR salvo, further draining an interceptor inventory that was already critically depleted. And then, the third wave. 70 Fatah-2 hypersonic glide vehicles, arriving at the end of the engagement sequence, found 4 destroyers with severely depleted interceptor inventories, degraded defensive system performance from the continuous engagement tempo of the preceding waves, and combat management computers operating at the absolute ceiling of their processing capacity. The Fatah-2's maneuvering terminal phase defeated every remaining intercept attempt. Multiple weapons struck each vessel. The fires, the flooding, and the catastrophic structural damage that resulted from multiple hypersonic warhead impacts against ships whose defenses had been deliberately exhausted before the most lethal weapons arrived produced 4 total losses in under 20 minutes. The waters off Jask Island became, in those 20 minutes, the site of the worst single engagement loss of American naval assets since the Second World War. The operational lesson, stated plainly, is this. The layered saturation approach to anti-ship warfare, when executed with sufficient volume across sufficient threat categories, can defeat even the most capable shipborne air defense system in the world. The American naval establishment knew this theoretically. Jask Island has now proven it operationally. And that distinction between theoretical knowledge and operational proof changes everything about how American adversaries around the world will now look at United States naval power. Now let us talk about what Trump has actually ordered. Because when a president uses the phrase full retaliation in the context of 1,200 dead American sailors and 4 destroyers on the seabed, the operational content of that phrase is not rhetorical. The immediate force mobilization picture is already visible in its broad outlines. 3 carrier strike groups, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the USS Harry S. Truman, have been ordered to converge on the Gulf of Oman and Arabian Sea operating areas. The combined air wing capacity of those 3 carriers represents approximately 250 strike aircraft, capable of generating sustained sortie rates against Iranian targets that no Iranian air defense system can fully absorb. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers have been recalled from their home bases to forward staging locations within strike range of Iranian territory. That deployment signals one specific intention: the employment of deep penetrating munitions against hardened underground targets that conventional aircraft cannot reliably defeat. This is not a show of force. This is a targeting decision. Submarine-launched Tomahawk cruise missile packages have been pre-positioned against a target list that American intelligence has been maintaining and updating for years. And the target set itself? It is extensive. Iranian air defense systems, the S-300 batteries, and the indigenous Bavar 373 systems that protect Iranian airspace are the first priority, because suppressing Iranian air defenses is the prerequisite for everything that follows. Iranian ballistic missile production facilities, the underground complexes where the weapons that just sank 4 American destroyers are manufactured, are high-priority targets. The IRGC naval bases along the Makran coast, the facilities from which the Jask Island strike was launched and coordinated, are priority targets. And the nuclear infrastructure that has been the underlying motivation for the American-Iranian confrontation for 2 decades is on every target list any serious American war planner has ever developed. Here is what Trump's full retaliation order does not include. And this is the operationally significant omission that you need to understand. It does not specify a defined end state. The order specifies what American forces are authorized to strike. It does not specify what outcome those strikes are intended to produce, or what Iranian response would be considered acceptable versus what Iranian response would trigger further American escalation. That ambiguity is not an oversight. It reflects the genuine strategic difficulty of defining achievable objectives in a military confrontation with Iran that any honest assessment must acknowledge. Destroying Iranian military infrastructure does not eliminate Iranian military capability, because Iranian military capability is distributed, hardened, and in significant proportion located in underground facilities specifically designed to survive the kind of air campaign American forces are preparing to execute. Destroying Iranian nuclear infrastructure may set the program back by years, but does not eliminate the knowledge, the personnel, or the institutional commitment that drives it. And any American strike campaign that kills Iranian military personnel and destroys Iranian infrastructure will produce an Iranian response whose nature, scale, and targeting will be determined by Tehran's own escalation calculus, which no American war game has reliably predicted. Now, I want to be direct about something that the political discussion surrounding Trump's retaliation order has consistently refused to state plainly. Every American military option available in this situation carries a risk of triggering consequences that dwarf the original provocation in their global economic impact. And the variable that makes that true is the Strait of Hormuz. 21 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Approximately 1/3 of the world's liquefied natural gas transits the same choke point. The economies of Japan, South Korea, China, India, and every major European nation are linked to the continued flow of energy through those 21 miles of water between the Iranian coast and the Omani Peninsula. When that flow is interrupted, not reduced, not threatened, but physically interrupted, the global economic consequences begin within 72 hours and accelerate to levels that no government economic model has seriously prepared for. Iran's ability to close the Strait of Hormuz in response to American military action is not theoretical. It is operational. The Iranian naval and aerospace assets positioned along the Makran coast and on the islands within the strait, Abu Musa, the Tons, and the network of hardened coastal facilities built specifically for strait interdiction operations, constitute a layered anti-access capability that American naval forces cannot rapidly suppress without a sustained campaign that itself carries additional escalation risks. Here is the operational reality. Minefields can be laid faster than they can be swept. Coastal missile batteries can be destroyed, but replacement systems can be brought forward from inland positions. Fast attack craft can be sunk, but their replacements can be launched from hardened coastal shelters. The Strait of Hormuz is Iran's strategic leverage over the global economy, and any American military action that threatens the Iranian regime's survival will trigger its use. The oil price mathematics of a Hormuz closure are straightforward, and they are terrifying. At current global demand levels, a one-week interruption of Hormuz transit would produce oil price increases that analyst models suggest could reach $200 to $300 per barrel from a current baseline in the $80 to $90 range. A sustained closure of 2 weeks or more would produce supply shortages in Asian importing economies that cannot be compensated for through strategic reserve releases at the required scale. The inflationary, recessionary, and social stability consequences of that price shock would be felt in every economy on Earth, with the most severe impacts falling on the developing nations that have the least capacity to absorb them. Trump's political calculation in ordering full retaliation is understandable. From a domestic American perspective, 1,200 dead sailors and 4 sunken destroyers demand a response that is visibly proportionate to the provocation. But the strategic calculation that underlies that political logic must account for the Hormuz variable in ways that the public retaliation order does not acknowledge. The American response that satisfies the domestic political requirement may trigger the Iranian response that produces the global economic catastrophe. Managing that tension is the most consequential challenge any American president has faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And unlike Kennedy in 1962, Trump is managing it in a media environment that provides no space for the quiet back-channel diplomacy that ultimately resolved that confrontation. Now, here is the dimension of this crisis that Western media coverage has almost entirely missed. and I want to make sure you understand it because it changes the entire strategic picture. In the hours since the Jask Island strike, there has been no signal from Tehran suggesting that the prospect of American retaliation is producing the kind of strategic recalculation that American deterrence theory predicts it should. There has been no back-channel communication indicating willingness to negotiate. There has been no reduction in operational tempo, suggesting Iranian forces are standing down in anticipation of a diplomatic resolution. There has been instead a public statement from IRGC leadership that explicitly acknowledges American retaliation as expected, characterizes it as acceptable within Iran's strategic framework, and promises a response to that retaliation that Iran's own spokespeople described as disproportionate by design. This is not irrational. It reflects a strategic calculation that is internally coherent once you understand the framework within which Iranian decision-makers are operating. Iran did not sink 4 American destroyers because its leadership miscalculated the American response. It sank them because its leadership concluded that the American response, including the full retaliation Trump has now ordered, is a cost Iran can absorb, and that the strategic benefit of demonstrating that American naval power can be defeated in a direct engagement outweighs that cost by a margin the current moment made worth paying. That calculation rests on 3 foundational assessments that Iranian strategic planners have been developing and refining for years. The first, American military action against Iran, regardless of its scale and destructiveness, cannot produce the regime change outcome that would eliminate the Iranian threat, because the social, political, and institutional foundations of the Iranian state are more resilient than American planners have consistently assumed. The second, Iranian retaliatory capability, including the Hormuz closure option, imposes costs on American escalation that constrain how far the response can practically go before the global economic consequences become politically unsustainable in Washington. The third, the international political environment, Russia providing diplomatic cover, China constrained by its own energy import dependency, the developing world offering moral support, and the domestic American political debate providing structural limits on open-ended military commitment, limits the duration and intensity of any American campaign in ways that Iran's own staying power can outlast. The will that sustains this strategic framework was not manufactured by the current leadership. It was forged across 50 years of external pressure that consistently produced the opposite of its intended effect. Every sanction that failed to produce compliance, every operation that failed to break the program, every military threat that failed to produce strategic concession, added another layer to an institutional conviction that external pressure is a problem to be managed, not a condition to be accepted. The 4 American destroyers on the seabed off Jask Island are the operational expression of that conviction at its most consequential. So where does this end? Let me give you my honest assessment, because that is what this moment demands. The next 48 hours represent the most dangerous window in the Middle East since the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Not the most dangerous in terms of the military balance between the immediate combatants, but the most dangerous in terms of the range of outcomes that could emerge from the decisions being made right now in Washington, Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, and the capitals of every nation whose energy security depends on the continued flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. The optimistic scenario, the one in which American strikes degrade Iranian military capabilities sufficiently to satisfy the domestic political requirement of visible retaliation, Iran absorbs those strikes without triggering the Hormuz closure, and back-channel communication produces a de-escalation framework that neither side publicly acknowledges, requires a degree of mutual restraint and tacit coordination between adversaries who are simultaneously killing each other's personnel and destroying each other's infrastructure. That scenario is not impossible. History contains examples of adversaries managing escalation under conditions that appeared to preclude restraint. But it requires that both sides simultaneously calculate that the cost of continued escalation exceeds the benefit. And the signals currently emanating from both Washington and Tehran suggest that neither side has reached that calculation yet. In Moscow, the response to the Jask Island strike and the American retaliation order has been calibrated to the millimeter. Public calls for restraint, delivered with the tone of a party privately satisfied with how events are developing. Russia bears no direct costs from a military confrontation between the United States and Iran. It benefits from the diversion of American attention and resources. It benefits from the oil price increase that a Hormuz disruption would produce, given Russia's own hydrocarbon export revenues. And it benefits from every demonstration that American military power has operational limits that a determined regional adversary with capable weapons can exploit. The Kremlin is not going to provide the off-ramp that prevents this escalation. It has no incentive to do so. In Beijing, the calculation is more complex and more consequential. China is the largest single importer of Gulf oil. Approximately 40% of its oil imports transit the Strait of Hormuz. A Hormuz closure does not benefit China the way it benefits Russia. It imposes costs on China that are severe enough to constitute a genuine strategic concern. But China's ability to influence the immediate situation is limited by a dynamic that has characterized its Middle East posture throughout this entire conflict. It can call for restraint, it can offer mediation, but it cannot compel either side to accept terms that their own strategic calculations have led them to reject. Here is what I want you to understand about the world on the other side of the next 48 hours. Whatever that world looks like, the permanent strategic legacy of the Jask Island engagement is already established. Regardless of how the immediate crisis resolves, 4 American destroyers have been sunk in a direct engagement with Iranian forces. That fact cannot be diplomatically reframed. It cannot be absorbed by the American security establishment without producing a fundamental reassessment of naval force posture, anti-ship missile defense architecture, and the strategic assumptions that placed those 4 ships in the engagement envelope of 300 Iranian missiles without adequate protection against the specific threat combination that destroyed them. The assumption of American naval invulnerability, the foundational premise of American power projection in this region for 3 generations, has been operationally defeated. The deterrence architecture built on that premise requires reconstruction from its foundations, and that reconstruction will happen in a strategic environment permanently altered by the demonstration that a self-reliant regional power with precision anti-ship weapons, the operational will to use them, and the strategic patience to wait for the right moment can defeat the world's most powerful navy in a direct engagement on terms entirely of its own choosing. 4 destroyers, 300 missiles, 20 minutes, 1,200 sailors. Those are the numbers that define what happened off Jask Island. They are also the numbers that have set in motion a chain of events whose endpoint no one, not in Washington, not in Tehran, not in Moscow or Beijing, can predict with confidence. Trump has ordered full retaliation. Iran has promised a disproportionate response to that retaliation. The Strait of Hormuz, the energy lifeline of the global economy, sits at the center of a military confrontation that neither side has yet shown any inclination to step back from. I have spent 30 years analyzing how military confrontations escalate and how they de-escalate. And the honest conclusion I draw from everything I can observe about this situation is that the de-escalation pathway is narrow. It requires simultaneous good faith from adversaries who are currently killing each other. And it depends on external actors, China most critically, whose interests are not fully aligned with the outcome that de-escalation would produce. The escalation pathway is wide. It requires only that one side makes the next decision, and that the other side determines that the decision demands a response, and that the responding side's own threshold calculations cannot absorb that response without further escalation. The Middle East has hours left before American retaliation begins. What those hours produce, whether back-channel communication creates space for a managed de-escalation, or whether the domestic political imperatives on both sides drive the confrontation past the point where management is possible, will determine whether the world economy survives this crisis intact or pays a price measured in years of disruption. What is your assessment? Can Trump's retaliation achieve its objectives without triggering the Hormuz closure that turns a regional military crisis into a global economic catastrophe? Or has this confrontation already crossed the threshold where escalation is the only trajectory available to either side? Drop your analysis in the comments. This is the conversation that matters most right now, and every response gets read. This is Flash America. If this breakdown delivered the depth and honesty this moment demands, share it, hit like, and subscribe right now. The next update goes out the moment this situation develops. Stay with me.